Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to participate in this really exciting and really important lecture series with some of my esteemed colleagues and dear friends. My comments are going to be focused primarily on the other side of the Atlantic in the Americas. Um, and when we discuss the struggle for black liberation in the American context, I think we often don't pay enough attention to its relationship to struggles for black liberation and self determination on the African continent. And in fact, when the scholar and theorist Cedric Robinson writes about what he famously terms the black radical tradition, he actually locates the origins of that tradition on the African continent, as African people, of course, many of whom are African Muslims, struggle to resist European domination and the ravages of the New World Order that contact with the European powers brought. And of course, Sheikh Umar Futi Tal, who Dr. Farah Al Sharif presented on, I think really embodies that phenomenon. And he, as well as Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, who Dr. Zachary Wright spoke about, these are two figures that I think really help to demonstrate the discursive nature of the transatlantic struggle for black liberation. By that, I mean there's a kind of conversation happening across the Atlantic that goes all the way back to the earlier period of American slavery, as enslaved Africans who are forcibly brought to the Americas bring with them word about what's happening on the African continent. And we see how this informs, for instance, the slave uprising insurrection in Bahia, Brazil, the Malay slave revolt. But this continues all throughout the period of American slavery and even into the period after emancipation. And I want to start by mentioning a figure who figures prominently in many genealogies of Islam in America, and that's Edward Wilmot Blyden, who is sometimes termed the father of Pan-Africanism. I think he really gives us another window into this discursive kind of relationship. When he travels to Liberia in 1850 and resides in West Africa for a number of years, spending time in Liberia and Sierra Leone, he actually encounters folks who fought in the revolutionary struggle with Sheikh Umar Futi. And these are among the people who make a mark on his thinking, his consciousness, to give him the impression that Islam has a more empowering, more liberatory impact on African people than Christianity, or at least the form of Christianity that his missionary employers are promoting at the time. And Blyden, of course, goes on to have an impact on a number of intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic, including the Sudanese Egyptian activist and artist and Pan-African journalist Dus Muhammad Ali, and his one-time mentor, Dus Muhammad Ali's one-time mentee, rather, and occasional collaborator, Marcus Garvey, both of whom very much influenced by Blyden. Blyden might be the first historical actor that we know of to use the phrase Africa for the Africans. This is a call that, of course, Marcus Garvey takes up. And when Kwame Nkrumah is introduced to the writings of Marcus Garvey while in what is today Ghana, and then, of course, comes to America and spends time in Harlem and becomes even more impacted by Garvey's work and thinking, he takes that same call for Africa for the Africans back with him to West Africa and becomes the founding president of Ghana when it gains its independence in 1957. And of course, Nkrumah is a frequent collaborator and he's in conversation rather with Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, who 2 years later in 1959 pens his treatise entitled Africa for the Africans. So when we look at Blyden, Dus Muhammad Ali, Garvey, Nkrumah, Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, we see this kind of discursive relationship, this conversation that's happening across the Atlantic, and we see how Muslims are among the folks who are at the heart of that conversation. But I want to focus for the rest of my talk on a later period in the 20th century, actually in the second half of the 20th century, when we see the emergence of a number of radical black nationalist and Pan-Africanist thinkers who are deeply influenced by black urban societies, of which Islam has become increasingly a part of the religious fabric, of the fabric of religious and cultural life. And I'm going to focus on the Northeast because that's where my research is centered, in New York City and in nearby Newark, New Jersey. So in Newark, New Jersey, we can look at Amiri Baraka, right, the celebrated poet laureate of Newark, New Jersey, author, organizer, activist. And Amir Baraka, of course, actually receives his name from a man named Sheikh Hisham Jabir. And Amir Baraka studies Islam and embraces Islam at the hands of Sheikh Hisham Jabir and practices Islam for a time. Sheikh Hisham Jabir being a representative of this very old tradition of Orthodox Islam among African Americans in that region. And Sheikh Hisham Jabir he's also famous for performing the janazah, the burial, funerary rites for Malcolm X. And Sheikh Hisham Jabir is an African American from North Carolina who presents his identity as being Sudanese. And now this presentation, which is something that we'll find is rather common among African American Muslims actually at this time, comes from his knowledge of the fact that Sudan is representative of of sort of sub-Saharan Africa in Arabic literature and in Muslim societies historically, right? So this is his way of asserting that his history doesn't begin with American slavery or with the transatlantic slave trade, right? And this is one sort of snapshot of this relationship between Islam and Africanity and Black radicalism. Another example we can find in nearby New York, right? And so in New York City, you have a community, one of the first Muslim communities founded in New York City. It's established by a man named Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal and his wife, Mother Khadija Faisal. These are two Afro-Caribbean Muslims who similarly celebrate African history, African identity, the relationship between Islam and Africa in the form of Muslim societies on the African continent, both in their work as artists before they take up the mantle as promoters of their Muslim faith, and also in Muslim community life. As founders of this mosque in Brooklyn, they promote this idea of embracing and learning African history among the folks who are attending this community. And so out of this context, we find the emergence of, again, you find a linkage of Islam, Africanity, and Black radicalism sort of in the imagination and in the consciousness of the community in New York City. And you actually find a number of sort of artistic and cultural institutions that emerge in New York City that reflect that. You have an institution called Ethno Modes Folkloric Workshop, which is actually founded by a husband and wife couple who are Muslims and artists in New York City who attend Sheikh Dawood's mosque. You also have another institution called the Sankori Nubian Islamic Workshop, which is founded, or Sankori Nubian Cultural Workshop, founded and led by a renowned Garveyite and Muslim by the name of Queen Mother Mariam Samad. And the Ethno Modes Folkloric Workshop, I should mention, is founded by Bala Abdurrahman and his wife Rakia Abdurrahman. So these are some of the institutions that bear a cultural impact in New York City. And so out of that context, we find in the 1960s the emergence of a network of organizers, Pan-African radical Muslim activists, many of whom go on to be among the founders of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party. And among them is Lumumba Abdul Shakur, a founding leader of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party, and the son of Salahuddin Shakur. Now, Salahuddin Shakur is an important figure in this history because Salahuddin Shakur is a man who is both a part of the Muslim Mosque Inc. and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. So these are the two institutions that Malcolm X founds when he leaves the Nation of Islam. And he becomes something of a mentor, of a father figure to this network of Black organizers and activists in New York City, which including his son Lumumba Abdul Shakur and his son Zaid Malik Shakur, both of whom are ultimately killed by agents of the state. But also you find his legacy, sort of the bearing of his legacy in the adoption of the Shakur name by a number of other well-known Black radical organizers like Assata Shakur and Mutulu Shakur, right? So this is something that folks might be familiar with. As well, in that sort of context, in that milieu, you have Bilal Sunni Ali and Sekou Odinga, right? I'll say Sheikh Bilal Sunni Ali and Sheikh Sekou Odinga, who are now elders who have lived a life of struggle in the cause of Black liberation, who are part of this sort of circle. Also both Muslim, also both founding members of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party, and even in the adoption of names like Sekou, right, which is a particular sort of West African rendering of Shehu or Sheikh, as in names like Sekou Toure of Guinea, or Sekou Ahmed Lobo, right, of sort of historical Mali. And names like Sunni Ali, right, as in Sunni Ali Bear, right? So even in the adoption of not only Arabic names, but African Islamic names, names that point to a sort of African Islamic history, demonstrates the deep impact of this fusion, this association of Islam, Africanity, and Black radicalism in cities like New York and Newark and other places. But I want to focus on these to give us, for the sake of time, basically. But in this history, you find the ways in which this kind of Islamic mark on Black radicalism can be sort of recouped or rescued. It often gets obscured. In fact, there's a story, and this story, a similar sentiment was shared to me by Bilal Sunni Ali, but also Daruba bin Wahad, right, who's another well-known, Black Muslim radical organizer from this context, another member of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party as well, who still is alive and writing and speaking quite frequently. And he tells a famous story of when folks from this New York cadre of radical organizers, who all happen to have an affinity for Africa, and many of whom are Muslim, when they meet the leaders of the West Coast of the sort of the Oakland chapter of the Black Panther Party, the famous Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, and how Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, because of histories of sort of conflict with certain African nationalist or sort of Afrocentric political formations on the West Coast, have think sort of derisively about what they call cultural nationalism, African cultural nationalism. And so when they encounter this cadre of folks from the Panther Party who found the New York chapter of the Panther Party from New York, they first respond sort of derisively at their names, right, at these sort of African and Islamic names, right? And Daruba bin Wahad mentions that when they brought Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale to New York, to Harlem, where they could see, again, this linkage of Islam, Africanity, and this Black radical tradition, they got it. It made a little bit more sense, right? And this was, perhaps a source of tension throughout, but this sort of marks much of the Black radical organizing that's happening on the East Coast. And we see it in other formations as well, like the Republic of New Africa, like the Revolutionary Action Movement, like the Black Liberation Army, right? And so in this, we get a sense of this linkages, of the role that Muslims who are sort of African facing, right? African minded, who have an affinity for Africa, their contribution and their stamp on the emergence of a Black radical tradition and Black radical organizing and struggles for Black liberation in America, in North America, right? In the 20th century. And I'll end by mentioning, this same context of New York City we find is a context that allows for Sheikh Hassan Sisi, the grandson of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, who is also a promoter or representative of a sort of Pan-African political orientation as a prominent Muslim scholar from West Africa. When he comes to America in 1976, he first comes to New York City, to Harlem, and he encounters members of this community, including members of a mosque known as the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, which is sort of the lineal descendant of Malcolm X's Muslim Mosque, Inc., which is also attended by folks who are part of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party in the Bronx and whatnot. So you see how these communities are intertwined. But it's members of these New York City Muslim mosques who encounter Sheikh Hassan and decide to follow his leadership. And so he finds a captive audience among these African-oriented Muslims who are part of this kind of cultural context in New York City. And he finds the same thing when he goes to Detroit, and then he goes to Cleveland, and he goes to Chicago, and he goes to Atlanta. And in all of these places, he finds people for whom Pan-Africanism and Islamic identity are linked, right? And this becomes the beginning of this network of communities that's established, and that's still continuing to this day. And so I'll kind of end there, and my hope is that once we convene and have a discussion, we can explore together, again, this kind of interconnected transatlantic project for Black liberation, and how Islam and Muslims are very much a part of this collaboration and have been for a long time and continue to be. Thank you very much.